Hi, everyone. Hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here. Welcome to ConLaw. This will be a fun class, I promise. We will be talking about things that you find fascinating, engaging, real-time, that affect your lives every day. And I'm very happy that you're all in my class. So to start, today is not going to be your usual lecture, unfortunately for you. My goal for today, and it's an ambitious one here, is to walk you through the entirety of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. It's a travesty that many law students graduate law school without ever reading all three of these documents, which is why I gave them to read in their entirety the first day of class. The only way I can conceivably do this is if there are no questions. I promise you, the rest of the semester you can ask me any question you want. If you have any questions afterwards, stick around. I'll be here till you're done. But I need to go straight through. So I'm going to pass around a few things. So first, the attendance roster and the sign-in sheet. I don't really care where you sit, but once you find a seat, stay there so know who you are. It makes my life a lot easier. And second, I have a present for each of you. This is a pocket constitution, okay? Please bring this to every class, okay? Can you just pass these around, please? Thank you so much. Take one, take two if you want for your friends and family, but I promise you we will be looking at it. Show some respect for the Constitution. This is how you start the semester off? My God. Oh, man. Starting on the wrong foot. Sacred text now. I'm mostly joking, but the trick is you keep one in every suit jacket. That's why you're never too far from your heart. Anyway, so take a Constitution, bring it to every class. You'll be looking at it throughout the semester. Everyone I'm seeing has the book, which is good. I assume everyone has the readings, which are good. And we will be starting with actual cases on Thursday. But if no one else has any other questions, we will begin. So July 4th, 1776 is a date which most people know because of hot dogs and fireworks and independence. But this day has a much greater legal significance. And it's fitting that our country was born by a bunch of lawyers. Virtually all of the people who wrote our founding documents were attorneys, much like yourselves. And at very young ages, remarkably, they achieved things which, frankly, I can't even imagine achieving. And one of the first documents that we'll study in this class, which hasn't been knocked on the floor quite yet, but perhaps will be, is a Declaration of Independence. Okay? Why is this Declaration of Independence so important? Because it was a death warrant. What do I mean by that? In 1776, by declaring that you wanted to separate from England, the colonies were openly stating their treason. Every single person who put their name on this document was telling King George III, if you catch me, you will execute me. So these weren't just idle pronouncements and philosophical, discussions, right? If anyone else wants them, you can take one every class. These were actually a legal statement of why the United States was separating from the United Kingdom. Knowing full well that anyone who signed this document was liable to be killed. So what I'm going to do is I have actually the text of all three documents on the screen. So if you want to look at me or look at those screens, and by the way, this is going to be a blooper reel for the semester, right? Yeah, I will hit my head, I promise. It will happen. I'll try my best not to. What was a declaration? It was a legal document sending a signal, but to the people of the world. And we look at its text. This is the part that people always read. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds. What does this mean? This isn't just saying we don't like you anymore. There actually were legal bonds connecting the colonies to England. There were charters of government, and these were to be immediately severed. Why are we separating? The core of the Declaration is listing the reasons why the United States can no longer be part of the British colony. So where do we get the authority to do this? Well, what's interesting is that at the time, law wasn't just what was written in the law books. There was a theory of law, which many of you studied perhaps, called natural law. This was a sense that there's some higher power, that when we do certain things, we're not just doing it because a statute book tells us, or because a court, a common law decision tells us, but there's actually a higher power, what Thomas Jefferson refers to as the laws of nature, and of nature's God. This idea that we're actually born with certain rights which cannot be alienated. Remember, property, to alienate means to transfer. These are rights which we cannot give up. They're inalienable. And they come from God. And these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And anytime any government becomes destructive of those ends is when we have to separate. Because why do we have government in the first place? It's to secure these rights. That's a very function of government, is to secure these rights which were protected from above. And when government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. That no government that fails to respect these rights can exist long. And then they have to institute a new government. What Jefferson's doing here, in the span of 3 paragraphs, you want to talk about Iraq, right? Remember legal writing? In the span of 3 paragraphs, he's basically stated the case for why the old government didn't protect our rights. That these rights come from above, and we need a new government to protect these rights. It's a remarkable, persuasive argument in a very compressed space. That's what I'm saying. These people were in their 20s and 30s writing these documents. It's remarkable how much they accomplished. But we shouldn't lose sight. I realize this is Texas, right? But we can't have a revolution whenever we feel like it, right? We can't damn well secede because we want to. What does Jefferson say? We don't separate for these light and transient, meaning not that significant causes, right? There has to be something very, very big. This long train of abuses that amounts to absolute despotism, tyranny. And only then do we have the obligation to throw off such a government, right? So what is the purpose of the Declaration? To list all of these abuses, to explain how horrible things have been. And keep in mind, Jefferson wasn't just talking to the king. He was talking also to the other nations of the world. Make no mistake, the second we declared our independence, the other nations had a decision to make. France, Spain, do we side with the English? Or do we side with these upstart colonies? Because a nation by itself cannot withstand with that trade. Fortunately for us, the French hated the Brits. And they were like, okay, I got an idea, right? Let's give these colonies some money and they can fight a war, distract the British, we can invade them in Europe, right? Okay, whatever works for us, right? But the French were our biggest allies during the Revolution, oddly enough. Okay, so what is the Declaration? A list of these repeated injuries and usurpations, right? That amounts to tyranny. Jefferson's writes, let these facts be submitted to a candid world. We are stating publicly our case for why these colonies no longer should belong to the United Kingdom. And again, this was their death warrant. This was an act of high treason, and they would have all been hung had we lost the American Revolutionary War. He then proceeds to list a number of grievances. Remember Festivus, right? Area grievances. This is the ultimate Festivus grievance list, right? One after another, what has the king done? He has refused his assent to our laws. You may not think about this, right? But when you go and vote and you put people in this Texas State House or in Congress, they vote for laws, the governor signs it, whatever, right? But what happens if the people can't make their own laws? What if the laws are frozen in place? This is precisely what happened during the reign of King George III. He would not let people make their own laws without his permission. And that was permission he never gave, right? He neglected to attend to the very laws. And what if you couldn't vote for your own representatives. The third one says he's basically gotten rid of legislatures. The king dissolved the state houses and said, you cannot meet because you are passing laws that I don't like. And instead of having governments close to you, he has called legislative bodies distant and faraway places. The entire deal about taxation without representation, remember that? That's what it means. That people in England are making decisions about the solvency and the credit of the United States without their input. And he dissolved those houses and prevented others from being elected. Basically, the king was systematically dismantling our system of elected government, which we've had for nearly 200 years in the colonies. And by doing so, he crippled what was known as the English system of rights. There was no way to protect these rights. Okay? He didn't just stop the legislatures. He stopped the judiciary. He basically made judges dependent upon his will. So imagine, if you will, you're a judge, and who pays your salary? The king. And if you make a decision the king doesn't like, guess what happens? You're fired. Now, a little Trumpism, right? You're fired, you're gone. How do you think you as the judge are going to rule? Well, you're not going to be very independent. By making the judges independent on the king's will, he basically destroyed the judiciary. See what's going on here, right? They can't make laws. They can't decide who's in charge of them. And they can't have independent judges. Basically, all three branches of what we know as government were basically crippled by the king. But wait, it gets worse. How was the king supposed to enforce these horrible laws? By sending his own agents. I love this expression, right? Swarms of officers, right? You think of like a swarm of bees, right? To go into people's homes. Do they need a warrant? No warrant was necessary. Why? Because the judges worked for the king. They issue these things called writs of assistance. A writ of assistance. You know what that is? It's basically a general warrant, which means I give you, inspector whatever, the power to go to any house you want. One of the reasons why we fought in the American Revolution was because basically the customs officers can go to any house at any time. These writs of assistance were very, very, very evil documents. But these weren't just tax collectors. They were standing armies. We take for granted today our military in many respects. But the framing generation was very afraid of a standing army. What do I mean? When you're in a fight, but when you're in time of peace, everyone goes home. Why do we need these troops standing around during a time of peace? Oh, I know why. Because the king's up to no good. And he's going to use that standing army against us. He's basically the military superior to civil power. And in doing so, he's deprived the Englishmen of all their rights. And not just that. These troops were allowed to live in your home. And this wasn't just because they were short on beds. They wanted to keep an eye on you. They could search your home. They could station a soldier in your home. Better not be up to any good. And what about if you were accused of breaking the law? Where was your trial held? You were given a mock trial overseas. Try getting a fair jury in England. You taxed us. You deprived us of the trial by jury. You created these arbitrary governments without any representation. These were people who had grown accustomed of living under parliament and living under a system of free laws. But under the king, they couldn't do any of these things. He suspended the legislatures. He abdicated the governments. He plundered our seas. There's a lot of pirate stuff going on here, right? There were lots of pirates ravaging the coasts. He even sent mercenaries. These were hired soldiers who were sent to the colonies for the sole purpose of destroying them. Okay? If you're getting the picture, things were really, really bad. One of the ones that people often focus on is he's basically brought on the merciless Indian savages to attack the colony. This one's a little bit overblown. But Jefferson was obviously trying to list everything he could think of. So what do we do with these 27 grievances, right? How do we turn these problems into a system of government? Jefferson writes, in every stage, we've asked for redress, we've asked for help. Please, stop, King, stop. But now we've crossed the point of no return. The king is a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Do you realize that saying anything bad about the king was a capital offense, much less calling him a tyrant? And Jefferson says this isn't just about the king. Our English brethren, our brothers, right? Help us. How can you sit by idly while the king oppresses us? But that time has passed too. In peace, you'll be our friends. In war, even your fellow British brother, enemies. So not only is this a political break, it's a cultural break. That the Union was actually breaking apart from their brothers in England. These were like, we had a civil war in this country, or Texas, War of Northern Aggression, right? These were a same type of civil war. We often think of the Revolutionary War, it was a civil war. It was an insurrection of people rebelling against their system of government. So this paragraph is very significant. I want to walk you through it very carefully. This paragraph accomplishes so much. He says, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America. Who are these representatives? Each of the 13 colonies sent to Philadelphia people to represent them. And they all agreed that this was the government for them. In General Congress assembled, they appeal to the supreme judge of the world, God, right? Look at this sentence very carefully. That these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Look at that. Very subtle, right? They went from colonies to states in one sentence. Isn't that poetic? They start off as colonies, oppressed, and they suddenly turn into free and independent states. Why? Because the political connection has been totally dissolved. This one paragraph affects the break between the UK and America. And now, as free and independent states, what can they do? Levy war, make peace, alliances, commerce, and do all the things that free states ought to do. By the way, within a matter of months, the United States would do all of the above. They would wage war against England. They would make alliances with France. They would establish treaties and trade so they can make money. These weren't just idle enactments. They were basically forming a government in the span of 2 sentences, which is a remarkable feat when you think about it. He closes basically saying, please let this work, right? And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Followed by 56 signatories. And again, each person whose name appeared on this document, I have a picture of it, I think over here. If you ever go to the National Archives of Washington, D.C., I'd recommend you go. Unfortunately, the document's almost so faded, you can barely even read it. I've tried. I can't make out a letter. Basically, in Congress, that's all I can read. But each person signing this was saying, okay, we're gonna die if we lose, but they're willing to pledge their honor for this. Okay? So what happened after the Declaration of Independence? Well, a long, bloody, protracted war was fought. It lasted 5 or 6 years, depending how you count. It's unclear exactly when it finished. During this time, though, the United States had government. it wasn't just based on the few sentences that I referenced in the Declaration about making war and commerce and alliances. A number of the people who drafted the Declaration of Independence said, you know, we need a government. And they formed a document called the Articles of Confederation. What's interesting about the Articles is that they were drafted in 1776, but were not agreed upon until 1781. Think about that for a minute. For 5 years, there was a central government that was not properly constituted. Maryland, by the way, was a holdout when we met at the state. It was Maryland. Maryland refused to sign this Articles of Confederation. Yet the government was still operating during the war. Why? They said, it's better to have something, right, than to have no government at all. And the Articles of Confederation sought to create a union, but a very weak one. What do I mean by a weak union? At the time, each of the 13 states had their own governments. They had their own courts. Each had a governor. Each had a legislature. Why did they even need a central government? Okay, this is a theme which sticks with us to this day, right? What is the proper balance of power between the states and the central government? A lot of the lessons we have in our Constitution, which I'll get to shortly, were drawn from mistakes under the Articles. A lot of the mistakes in the Articles resulted in a very bad situation. And much of the government we have today is because of those mistakes we made during those first few years. The Articles were in effect starting in 1781. The Constitution was drafted in 1787. So in a span of 6 years, we realized, guys, this isn't working. Let's try something else, right? So let's take a walk through the Articles of Confederation, okay? And actually understand some of the provisions. Now, this is a purely historical document. It doesn't have much legal significance. But to understand where our Constitution wound up, you need to know where the Articles began. First of all, what's a confederation? Well, when I say confederation, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is the Confederate States of America, right? Indeed, a confederation refers to a series of states that are only loosely connected, right? It's not a tight bond. And that each state has significant amounts of authority. So how does this document begin? Well, same way the Declaration does it. Hey, everybody, to all whom are present. Hi, we send our greetings. Hi, right? We announce that in Articles of Confederation, articles are basically documents, right? This document attesting to our union, not just any union, by the way, perpetual. What does perpetual mean? Forever. One slight detour. Is secession constitutional? Ooh. Was the secession of the southern states constitutional? Ooh, good question, right? Well, the Articles said that the union was perpetual, meaning forever. Does our Constitution say that? Nope. So there's a decent argument that secession was actually constitutional. We'll talk about the Civil War at great length. I promise we'll come back to it. But here we have these 13 states, Texas was not there yet, sorry, who have their union. And it's saying, hey, here's what you call us, right? We're called the United States of America. And this is a phrase which I'm sure everyone has said 1,000 times. But I want to think about something. Fill in the blank. The United States of America is or are. The United States of America is a country versus the United States of America are states. Believe it or not, when the Constitution was first drafted, this wasn't a single United States of America. It was states that were united. It was plural. I blew your mind, right? There were many states that were united in a place called America. It wasn't that there was one place called the United States of America. Each state was united. And each state had its own authority. Read it. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power that they previously had. Under the Articles, each state was indeed independent, bound only by whatever authority they gave up through this document. So think of it this way, right? When the states declared their independence, they basically had complete sovereignty, complete power over their borders, right? What happens when they formed this document? They gave some of it up. They said, okay, we'll keep all this authority, we'll give some of it up to the national government. And when the Constitution came, they gave more of it up. So when we study this, we start from the presumption that the states have this huge bound of power and have only relinquished what they gave up deliberately. Okay? So let's go through. The articles are numbered. So how is this union defined? A firm league of friendship. And what do? Well, for common defense and general welfare. Effectively, the only purpose of this league of friendship, which sounds like so, odd, is to protect against outside threats. That if there was some sort of problem within the state's borders, the state will handle it. If there was some sort of external threat from outside the country, well, then you have to get the Congress involved. Okay? But wait a minute. We're not just, neighbors, right? We're friends. So what happens if I'm living in New Jersey and I want to move to New York? Can New York treat me badly or treat me differently? No. In fact, we have this expression that intercourse with the people. So the people going from one state to the other are entitled to privileges and immunities. I want you to write that down, right? Privileges and immunities, this phrase right here. These were certain rights and freedoms people had. We'll come back to this phrase in about 30 minutes or so. It was important that when New York had a foreigner from New Jersey, right, cross over from the shore, he had to be treated equally. But you noticed who was excused from this? Fugitives from justice. What do you think they were talking about there? Slaves. So one of the interesting things about the Articles is that the word slave appears nowhere. And they use expressions to describe slaves. So here they call them fugitives from justice, which basically means runaway slaves. So that means if a runaway slave from Maryland, a slave state, went to Pennsylvania, a free state, no, that slave would not be entitled to whatever rights and privileges that the Marylander would. It gets even more deliberate in the next paragraph. If any person flees from justice, that means runaway slave, the governor of that state, so say a slave from Maryland runs away to Pennsylvania. That was actually the Mason-Dixon line, if you've heard of it. There's a sign on it. What's interesting is when, if you're driving south into Maryland, there's a big sign saying you are now crossing the Mason-Dixon line, right? But if you're going north, there's no sign. So Maryland's welcoming you. Anyway, if you flee from justice, the governor is required to deliver the slave back to the southern state, right? So what you're seeing here, and we'll be discussing this theme throughout, was attempts by the Union to form. And let me dwell on this point for a moment. We had 13 colonies with very, very different interests. The northern colonies were largely about trade, commerce, manufacture, textiles. They were almost all free states, although not exclusively. For example, New York had slavery, a lot of the other states had it. The southern states were almost entirely agrarian, farm. And their economies were built on the backs, quite literally, of slavery. The people who were framing this government realized that if they tried to fashion a government that had no slavery, we would have had 2 or 3 different countries. And a deliberate compromise was made, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to basically, let's not deal with this now. Let's try to form a government, and hopefully in the future, we'll get to the point where we can deal with it. Mixed results in that, yes, a union sustained, but the problem fermented and got even worse to the point where it resulted in a civil war that basically ripped the country in half. But you're already seeing the seeds of this split with our foundational documents. Okay? If you've noticed, there's not been a single thing about Congress yet, right? Finally, we have this Congress. How did it work? Each state, based on its population, would send delegates. Each state will get one vote. Okay? A big state like Virginia had the exact same weight as a teeny state like Delaware. No offense to Delaware, it's really small. You can drive across the entire thing in an hour. Okay? States could also recall their delegates, right? So say the state sent someone to be their delegate and he voted in a way they didn't like. They could say, come on back. The same way they would recall an ambassador to a foreign country. Because in every respect, this central government was like sending people to a foreign court, right? It wasn't actually part of their state government. Okay? What's this business? Freedom of speech and debate. So imagine this, right? A delegate from, let's say, Massachusetts votes in a way that, I don't know, a delegate from New York doesn't like. And while the delegate's traveling through New York, they arrest him for casting that vote. There's protection. That freedom of speech and debate shall not be impeached. In other words, these delegates have immunity. You know, the same way a diplomat never pays for his parking tickets, right? This is actually creating like an immunity. If you're from New York, you know what I'm talking about. They can't be punished for actions that are in their official line of business. So what can the states not do? Okay, so here we have the states agreeing to relinquish or give up some of their authority. And what are they giving up? Well, they can't make treaties with foreign governments, right? Virginia can't negotiate a separate treaty with France. The only way to negotiate treaties is with Congress, right? States can't enter into any treaties. States can't impose taxes on imports. This is a big deal. Because imagine if Virginia decides, I got an idea, we're a big cotton state, we'll start taxing everything. This will have screwed up commerce immensely. What can the states also not do? States can't keep vessels of war. States can't keep a navy during times of peace. The same fear of a standing army applied to the states. They can't keep standing bodies of forces, right? The states were not supposed to be having these military invasions. You don't think about this much, but it was not inconceivable that Maryland and Pennsylvania might go to war. This was not inconceivable. That actually states on a border may have such animosity, they may actually fight each other, right? You don't have this to think about. These were legitimate fears. Okay? What about a declaration of war? You need the consent of the Congress. That one state cannot go to war without everyone's consent. Okay? There's a slight exception, though. If your state's infested by pirates, you'll see a lot of discussion of pirates. I mean, this is not a problem anymore, like Johnny Depp style, right? But there were serious pirates that would just raid the coasts. So yes, you could attack the pirates if you wish. Okay. Basically, all war must be coming from Congress. Okay. Okay. This is a cool one. Does anyone know what a letter of marque and reprisal is? You don't know if you hear of this? These are awesome. This is basically a license to be a pirate. Okay. A letter of marque and reprisal means you can go to a country, steal whatever you want, burn whatever you want, and bring it back. You're basically a private soldier of the government. It gives you a license to be a pirate. And the best part is, this one's in our Constitution too. Okay. Our Constitution actually lets Congress issue letters of marque and reprisal. I want one really badly. I don't have to go anywhere, just to have to put on my wall. That'd be really nice. Okay. But what does the Articles of Confederation not have? Courts. We take for granted today that we have a system of federal courts, right? We don't have this in the Articles. You're allowed to create these little silly courts for piracy. What happens if there's a dispute between two different states? The court is Congress, right? There's no actual Supreme Court. The actual court itself becomes Congress. And the people in Congress assemble, decide who is going to win, who's going to lose. And if you read through it, there's an elaborate framework where you pick these judges, you pick these judges, and it's complicated. But there's no standing federal courts. Okay. All right. Okay. So trick question. Who was the first president of the United States? The answer is not George Washington. Hanson, good. Did you know that before?
I watched a video.
Oh, you cheated. By the way, so all my lectures are recorded. What's your name?
Michelle.
Michelle. So all my lectures record. It's actually recording right now. They're on YouTube. If you like, all my videos from last year online, and if for whatever reason you can't make a lecture or you weren't paying attention, go back and watch it again. I do take attendance and distribute them around, so you can't sneak around that. But I put that up for your benefit, and they're helpful. Okay, good. A lot of times, since I'm walking around, you're looking at an empty screen, which is kind of awkward, but we make do. So yes, the first president was a guy named John Hanson, right? He was a Marylander, and he was actually appointed the president of Congress under the Articles. He had no power, though, basically a worthless position. So indeed, George Washington, the general, as he liked to be called, was the first real president. Okay. This provision is significant. Taxes. How was the central government supposed to be funded? Today we have an income tax, right? And everyone who's had a paycheck. You're a night student. You've all had paychecks, I'm assuming, right? When I talk to the day students, some of them never actually had a paycheck, right? So when you have, it's true, believe me. So when you have a paycheck, you're paying taxes to the federal government. Under the Articles, there's no taxing system. So what were requisitions, right? Basically, based on the number of white citizens, and we'll come back to this in a minute, we do the three-fifths clause, based on the number of white citizens, slaves and Indians excluded, each state was expected to give money to the central government. Okay, and what happened if they didn't? Too bad. The weakness of the Articles was that there was no method to enforce it. There was no way to make them pay up. And oh, by the way, if the federal government can't make you pay, what idiot governor will send money to a central authority? Not going to happen. So within a span of a couple years, it went broke. In fact, General Washington, as he was fighting the American Revolution, kept complaining, saying, we need money, we need money, we can't afford to fight this war. But because they were not able to require from the state's funding, there were serious deficiencies, okay? So these requisitions are probably one of the biggest errors of the Articles that just simply did not work out, okay? What about passing laws, okay? Well, there were 13 colonies, you know. Today in Congress, we need 50 votes to pass a law, right? 50%. You needed 9 out of 13. Getting that kind of a unanimity, that kind of agreement was very difficult, okay? Even more importantly, what happens, okay? What happens if they want to get rid of the Articles of Confederation themselves? What happens if Congress wants to start a new document, what's called a constitution? How many votes were necessary? 13. To pass a law, you need 9. To change the charter, you needed 13. See who read ahead. How many states were required for ratification? 9. Our Constitution was illegal. Blow your mind, right? Our Constitution was unconstitutional. The article said you need all 13 states to agree to change the government. Our Constitution only required 9. It got 13 eventually. They twisted their arms, right? But the entire nature of our Constitution was illegitimate. I'll get there in a minute. Okay? It says here, the Union will be perpetual. Not really, lasted 6 years, but you know, close enough to forever, right? Okay. Anyway, so that's the article, right? So after the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified in 1781, there were significant problems because, number one, no one was required to pay taxes, right? States still did whatever they wanted. States would start taxing other states, and it was very disorganized. So in 1787, a bunch of people said, I got an idea, right? We need to think this entire thing through, right? We need to amend the Articles of Confederation. Again, to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed 13 votes. All the states had to agree. Okay? What happened over the summer of 1787 was something very different. States sent delegates to Philadelphia for the express purpose of amending the Articles. Instead, in the span of 3 months, in the span of 3 measly months, this entire document was written. I don't know how to say it in a humble way, but there really isn't. This is the single longest serving government document in the world. No other country in the world can lay claim to a continuous government like this. None. None. England perhaps may try saying, oh, our Magna Carta, the Great Charter, is 800 years old. Well, they've actually started repealing provisions of Magna Carta, unfortunately. And England has no written constitution. Fine, I'll give them credit, right? But this document, which I gave to each of you, if you don't have one, you can pick one up later, right? This document. Oh, perfect. Okay. You have good friends. Very good. This document, right? See, you guys watch after each other in night program. Day kids are cutting and scratching, right? It's good. It's good. You're friends. I had a class before. One guy didn't know where it was. I asked him a question. He didn't know the answer. The guy actually was looking like, point there, point there. Don't do that. Makes your friend look stupid. So this convention, this Constitutional Convention, 1787, did something that's frankly providential. I don't know any nice way of saying it other than that. They were able to form a system of government that's persisted for 200 years and persisted through trials and tribulations and civil wars and world wars and wars on terror and everything else. Yet at every juncture, due to circumstances I don't understand, the Constitution prevailed. One of the themes we'll have in this class is how close we got to the brink at many stages, right? We're here in the year 2015. There was no guarantee in 1787 that this would last 200 years, let alone 20 years, right? This union survived a new country with no friends. It survived a civil war over slavery, and an amendment to the Constitution to eradicate it. It survived Reconstruction, where basically the country was torn apart and built again. It survived the Industrial Revolution, which radically changed how people work and live. It survived not one but 2 world wars that tested almost every aspect of our Constitution and the powers of the federal government. It survived decades on into the war on terror and what we have going on today. And at every time when something could have gone the other way, something could have gone wrong, something could have gone so horribly wrong, the Constitution just said no. Where a president could have said, nah, not going to follow it, and just ignore it. And at every point, we pushed right to the brink. And I threw my hands up saying, no one went over the line. We're still here. I'm still teaching you about this document that's 200 years old. And one would think is irrelevant, but it's very relevant for all of your lives and virtually everything you do. So I do encourage you to bring this document to your class every day. Keep in your bag. And in the remaining, let's see, hour and 15 minutes, which is right where I want it to be, I'm going to walk through all the provisions. This class will be predominantly focused on a couple clauses. The Commerce Clause, which regulates commerce, the 14th Amendment, the First Amendment. That's probably 75% of the class. but there's a lot of other important stuff here that at least you will be exposed to once in your careers, and that is my goal. And I start with the preamble to the Constitution. Not because it has any effect. No, in fact, don't tell me the answer to the exam question is not going to be preamble. This provision doesn't have any legal significance. Every year someone will do it, but that's not the right answer. But it gives a very important message from the outset. Begins, we the people. Not we the states, but we the people. What's miraculous about the Constitution, unlike the Articles, was this is not a group of states coming together. It was a group of people coming together. The actual ratification of the Constitution was by people in every state, not elected officials, but people. And this was actually an interesting factoid, which I've been researching. I have to find this. At the time, New Jersey actually allowed suffrage for unmarried women. And I've been looking for about 7 years to see if any women actually voted on this. I haven't found the evidence, but I'm pretty sure somewhere there is evidence. I haven't found it. Freed slaves, probably not. But I'm still looking for the women, okay? And what did these people do? Form a more perfect union. Not a perfect union, a more perfect union. Why is this language significant? Because this is a process, right? We're not going to start off in the right direction right away. It's not going to be a straight line where it ought to go. It's working to make something more perfect. Will we ever get there? Probably not. We can try. And what are we trying to do? Domestic tranquility, peace at home, common defense. And we're trying to secure these secure these blessings of liberty. Not just to ourselves, but our posterity, people long in the future. That us 200 years later are still reading this document. That we're creating this Constitution of the United States for that process and those people. Okay? Now the Constitution is divided into 7 articles. And this you should remember. Article 1, the first article, refers to Congress. Okay, I'll give you the overview. Article 2 refers to the executive branch. Article 3 refers to the federal courts. You need to know these by heart. Article 1 is Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch. Article 3 is the courts. Know that one cold. And because I'll start saying Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, you'll need to know what I'm talking about. And if you ever get lost, it's in your book, right? It's right there. The exam is open book, but it's definitely open this. And you better look at it during the exam. If you don't, you're not going to do well. Okay? So where do we begin? All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of a Senate and a House of Representatives. What does this mean, all legislative powers herein granted? That means the powers are listed. In other words, all the powers listed in this document go to Congress. But what if a power is not listed? Congress does not have it. This is what's called the doctrine of enumerated powers. Congress only has those powers that are enumerated or listed in the Constitution. Anything that's not listed, Congress cannot do. So no, Congress can't do whatever it feels like. They can only do that which the Constitution permits them. Okay? And what is this Congress? Well, there's going to be 2 branches. There's going to be a Senate and a House of Representatives. So remember I said a minute ago that under the Articles, every state, big and small, has the same representation. This was a recipe for disaster. Why should Virginia, a huge state, have the same power as Delaware, a little teeny state? So a compromise was reached. This was the constitutional compromise. In fact, if you ever go to Connecticut and you see the license plate say the Constitution state, okay, that's because this compromise came from Connecticut. So what was this compromise? In the House of Representatives, it will be based on population. So the bigger states had more members of the House. But the Senate would be fixed. Every state would have only 2 senators. So that's why today Wyoming and California have the same number of senators. Go figure, right? It makes no sense. But the Senate is fixed. Okay? So the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. You have to be 25 years old and 7 years a citizen. Okay? And here comes the part of the Constitution that a lot of people have heard about. So in 2010, the Congress decided that they were going to read the entire Constitution from start to finish, every clause. No one wanted to read this part of the Constitution, and they skipped it. So I think that's a mistake, and I'll explain why. These were parts of our Constitution for a reason, and to just skip over it and ignore it is to whitewash history. We need to know what happened to know what was eliminated, right? This is what's often called the 3/5 clause. Okay, and I'll read it to you. Representative and direct taxes shall be apportioned, blah, 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 which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those blind served, blah, 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 3/5 of all other persons. Okay, so let's explain what's going on here. There's two issues, right? Representation and taxes. As we said before, the more people in a state, the more representation they had in Congress, right? So, you know, Virginia has a lot more people than Delaware. They'll get more representation. What about slaves? Let's just make up numbers, right? Let's say Virginia's population of free people was 100,000, and say there are 50,000 slaves. If you add them all together, Virginia now is 150,000 people. They get even more members of Congress. That was bad, right? Because effectively, the southern states would have such a larger population and have a more representation in Congress that they would basically predominate national issues. Try getting rid of the slave trade will never happen. I actually ran the numbers on this. Had the southern states been counted for full population, the slave trade would have never been eliminated. So in this respect, the northern states wanted to reduce a black person to 3/5. I know that sounds terrible, right? This is the part you're not actually taught in school, but this was actually a compromise to basically dilute the voting power of the South, right? The southern states wanted blacks to count 100%, gives them more votes in Congress. So in many respects, this was a compromise by diluting a person, as horrible as it sounds, diluted the voting power of the South. Never learned that, did you? But the other side, taxation, right? The southern states didn't want their slaves to count for taxes because if there were more slaves, they'd have to pay more taxes. So a compromise was reached. Let's treat a slave as 3/5 of a person. We will only dilute the voting power so much, but we still get taxes from the slaves. This was a terrible compromise that even had to be made. But had this compromise never been made, had the slaves been treated as full persons, right? The slave trade would have never been eliminated. It couldn't have been because there would have been enough votes. And oh, by the way, the Electoral College, we base on population. Every president would have been a Southerner. No question there. You could not have elected a president unless he favored slavery. So the decision of 3/5, and I told you, I actually ran the numbers on this, actually enabled the slave trade to be eliminated. Okay? So I think it's a mistake when Congress decides to just skip over a provision of the Constitution with actually understanding what it means. Now all of you understand what it means. It's a very delicate balance, but the people in the North were insistent on not giving full representation for the slaves. Because, oh, by the way, slaves couldn't vote. Of course, right? So basically, you're counting people for population, but you don't give them the vote. So it's like doubling up the vote of the slave owners. It would have been a recipe for disaster. Okay, and then what happened? The enumeration is basically having a census. Okay, which is not too important. Okay. Also, the House has the power of impeachment. We'll get to this later. But one of the sole remedies of Congress, if they don't like a judge or the president or someone else, is to impeach him. So here's the process, which people always screw up. The House of Representatives votes to impeach, and the Senate has a trial. It's a two-step process. What you'll notice is almost everything in our Constitution requires multiple parties checking each other, right? If anyone did the reading for class, the future, you'll see the expression from James Madison in Federalist 51. There's an expression which I'll repeat 1,000 times this year. But Madison wrote in Federalist Paper number 51, ambition must be made to counteract ambition, right? If you have a crazy House of Representatives, they want to impeach someone, well, unless the Senate agrees, that person can't be impeached. It's impossible in our government for one branch of government to do something by themselves. They need someone else to double them up, always. It was designed by that because we don't trust people. I don't trust people. I love all you. I don't trust any of you, right? Why? Because you have your own agenda. What actually works is if people can check each other, make sure that no one can move too far. Can we move on to the Senate? The Senate, again, has only 2 people per state. So Virginia and Delaware have the same representation. Also, the terms are for 6 years, not 2. I always feel like I give like a basic government primer because it's scary how few students actually study government in school today. It's actually startling, and I think it's a national travesty. As important as STEM and science engineering is, people need to know how the government works, and it's a sad state that people don't know this stuff. Okay, here we go. So if the House impeaches someone, the Senate tries all the impeachment. And what happens if the president is impeached? Well, the Chief Justice presides. In fact, when President Clinton was impeached in 1997, whatever it was, Chief Justice Rehnquist sat as a presiding officer. Wait a minute. Where's this Chief Justice coming from, right? Oh, we have federal courts now. All right, this is like a little hint. You're only in Article 1. That comes later in Article 3. But we have now federal courts for the specific purpose of impeaching a president. This was an important check. So that way, even if Congress hated the president and the Senate hated the president, you still have the Chief Justice of the United States making sure things went according to process. See, everything's checking at every single juncture. Okay, what about elections? Could Congress leave it up to the states to manage federal elections? Yeah, basically, each state can decide how elections work. But, oh, by the way, Congress can back that up. So imagine what happens if a state abolishes all elections, saying, yeah, we'll never have elections for federal officers. No. So the states have their authority, but Congress can always check it. Okay. This one's good. What happens if the people of a state vote someone who they really don't like? 2/3 vote, get rid of them. So Congress can actually get rid of people. Congress can get rid of members the people elect. Everything's always checking each other, right? The people vote for Congress, but Congress throw the people out. It's very well balanced. Okay. All right. Where are they getting money from? The United States Treasury. They're not relying on their states for salaries. This is so important because under the Articles, who was paying the salaries? The states. And if the states didn't like you, they dragged you home. They recalled you. Here, members of Congress being paid by the United States government. They are not dependent upon the states for their votes, and they can vote with their own conscience. Remember this one, speech or debate. Same deal. You can't arrest someone for some sort of action they take while they're on the Senate floor. This often happens where members of Congress conduct illegal activity in their offices, and then the FBI tries to raid them like, no, you can't come in because this is my speech or debate. It actually happens. This happens recently. A guy named William Jefferson from Louisiana, if I remember correctly, hid like $100,000 in a freezer in his office on Capitol Hill, and like said, you guys can't search my office. That didn't turn out well for him. Okay. All right. Okay. So now we turn to Article 1, Section 7. Okay. And this describes how Congress actually makes laws. We begin. All bills for raising revenue, that's called a tax, right? Raising revenue means tax, must originate in the House. Why? Because the House is closest to the people, right? The people vote for the House. If someone's going to be taxing you, it's going to be the people. Oh, and I forgot to mention, under the original Constitution, how were senators selected? By the state legislatures. Did you not know this? Originally in the Constitution, you didn't vote for the senators. The state legislatures voted for the senators. Right. So think about that. The states actually check Congress. And the states decide who goes to Washington. Again, checking each other. All right. So everyone, I'm sure, has seen Schoolhouse Rocks. Remember? How does a bill become a law? Okay, well, very simply. It passes the House, passes the Senate, and that's presented to the president. If the president signs it, it's law. If he vetoes it, it's not law. But Congress can overturn a veto by a 2/3 vote. I don't know, has anyone seen the Saturday Night Live episode about a year ago about the executive order? So there's we'll discuss this later, but there's a skit on Saturday Night Live where they did a parody of Schoolhouse Rocks. And, some guy saying, here's how a bill becomes a law. And some guy says, I'm an executive order. Let's push the bill down the steps. An executive order is not law. We would talk a lot about executive power this year, far more than I'd want to. But executive power cannot be law. Okay. Okay, making good progress. We will spend probably a third of our semester on this provision of the Constitution. So just like flag it in your book, put the little dog ear, right? Article 1, Section 8. Remember I said a few minutes ago that Congress only has the powers herein granted, right? Only the powers listed or enumerated. Article 1, Section 8 refers to Congress's enumerated powers. These are the powers actually given to Congress by the Constitution. I will say this till I'm blue in the face. Congress only has the powers that Constitution gives to them. Congress only has the powers that the Constitution gives to them. Congress does not have a free rein to whatever the heck they want. They can't do whatever they think is right. They only do that which the Constitution gives them the power to do. Got it? Okay. So you might be saying, wow, Josh, there's only like 20 things here. That means Congress can't do a lot. Well, over the last 200 years, these items have been expanded greatly. And we'll discuss that. So what's number 1? Well, remember during the Articles, they had to requisition money no one paid. Very first, number 1, to lay and collect taxes. And again, taxes was based on population. And under the 3/5 clause, they got 3/5 money for the slaves. Again, it was a compromise, and it was an odious one, but not for the reasons people think. The Southerners actually wanted full representation because they wouldn't have voted. Okay? 2, to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Right? This was significant. Right? Because this was still a young nation, a new nation. They needed to find ways of getting credit. Okay? The third one, and this is one that we will probably spend, 3 weeks on, says to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and the Indian tribes. This is the Commerce Clause. This is probably, in modern constitutional law, the most important provision of the Constitution. Why, Josh? Why is this so important? This is the provision that basically almost everything the federal government does today is based on. The word commerce in 1787 had a very fixed meaning. It meant trade, intercourse, if you will, right? When, person A sends something in Virginia to person B in Delaware, okay? It didn't mean any sort of commercial activity, or it didn't mean any kind of business, how perhaps you understand commerce today. It meant trade. Why would Congress have the sole power over trade? Oh, very simple. To prevent one state from making a trade barrier to another, right? What happens if Virginia said, hey, North Carolina, if you want to send cotton up north, you have to pay us a tax? That wouldn't work. So Congress had the sole power over regulating trade. But this provision will be blown up to include not just trade among 2 different states, but trade within one state. And not even trade. We'll learn a case called Rickard v. Filburn, where a farmer grows wheat on his farm, which only he eats, never leaves the farm. That's interstate commerce. We'll get there, I promise. Okay. What is this? To establish a rule of naturalization. That means immigration. Interestingly enough, during the early years of the Republic, there was really no citizenship. Has anyone noticed that the word citizenship has appeared nowhere in the Constitution? Except for being a citizen of the United States to be a member of Congress. States determine citizenship in the original Constitution. Interestingly enough. A uniform rule of bankruptcy, coining money, punishing counterfeits. Okay, post offices, yeah. This one, the science, progress of science, useful art. This is intellectual property. So if any of you know what a patent is, right? You basically, the government gives you a license to have an invention or design, and you're the sole owner for a number of years. Okay, has anyone seen the sheet? We got it? Is it? Perfect. Okay. And here comes a biggie for us. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. Oh, what's the Supreme Court business? Well, we'll get to the Supreme Court later. The Constitution creates the Supreme Court. I'll say that very clearly. If you want to read Marbury versus Madison for Wednesday, the Constitution creates the Supreme Court. All other courts Congress can create or destroy, but Congress can never get rid of the Supreme Court, right? With the cockroaches and Keith Richards will be there forever, right? Again, we have piracies. This was a big deal. One of the first wars the United States fought was against the Barbary pirates. They see the Somalian pirates of today. That's basically the same idea. The Barbary pirates around what's present-day Somalia would hijack all of our ships. All right, we can punish them. Okay. Declare war. This is the same as the Articles. The only branch of government that can actually declare war is Congress. Okay. And it has to be by both branches of Congress. What about armies? Are we dependent on the states for armies? No, no, no. The central government, the national government, can now support and raise armies and navies and the militias. Okay. I want you to start this one in your book, please. The last power listed is probably the most sweeping. It's what's often called the necessary and proper clause, or if you studied in middle school, the elastic clause. It says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying to execution the foregoing powers. What does this mean, necessary and proper? This clause always gives students a hard time. But let me explain it like this. The Constitution gives Congress the power to run a post office, right? No one disputes that, right? Everyone? Okay. Does anything in the Constitution say that Congress has the power to buy a wagon for the mail-in? Is there any wagon clause in the Constitution saying that Congress can buy a wagon for the mail? No. But wouldn't you say that in order to have an effective post office, you need to have wagons? Yeah. Would anyone say that the post office can't buy the wagons? No. So that's one understanding of this language, right? It's necessary to have wagons to have a post office. Same thing for a military, right? It says you can raise an army. Does it say that they can buy guns? Well, it doesn't say that specifically, but to have a military, it's necessary to have guns. This clause was designed to sweep in all the related stuff that government needs to do, but you can't list it. The Constitution is short, right? It fits in your pocket. There are lots of things government will need to do that aren't exactly listed in here. But the problem, and you'll say this in a case called McCulloch v. Maryland, which is next week, McCulloch v. Maryland, is how broadly does that power reach? Does the power to coin money include the power to make a bank? Whoa, right? If Congress has the power to coin money, which they do, there's no dispute, do the power to make a bank? There's nothing about making a bank in the Constitution. So one of the first big separation of powers cases, McCulloch v. Maryland, is can Congress actually make a bank? How necessary does something have to be? Is it just convenient? Is it useful? Yeah. We'll discuss this in upcoming weeks. But keep that one in mind. All right. We come back to the slavery issue. Article 1, Section 9. The migration and importation of such persons. Let me pause here for a second. The word slave appears nowhere in the Constitution. And this was very deliberate, right? Very deliberate. They didn't even want to acknowledge the word. And not because they didn't want to pretend it didn't exist. They didn't want to lend any legitimacy to the institution of slavery. And in fact, many prominent abolitionists, Lysander Spooner, Frederick Douglass, you name them, argued that slavery was unconstitutional. Why? Because they couldn't even use the word in the document. They said these such persons. Who are these persons? We don't know who these such persons are. We can't have a government by reference. They say here, the migration or importation of such persons, this is a slave trade, right? The actual, the triangle trade if you study in school, bringing slaves into the United States, shall not be prohibited until 1808. So basically for 20 years, the slave trade would remain in effect. Remember what I said earlier, that this was a compromise thing. All right, let's get over this hump. We'll deal with those problems later. That is Exhibit A, right? We can't get rid of this now. Let's leave it in place, and maybe in 20 years, Congress will have enough votes. By the way, if the Southern states had full representation for blacks, they would have never repealed the slave trade because they've had too many people. All those people that bring you have counted for full population. They could never repealed it. I told you, I ran the numbers on this. They would have never gotten rid of it. Okay. The next section, Article 1, Section 9. This is something that was very prominent during the Civil War and also the War on Terror. This writ of habeas corpus, right? What's this writ of habeas corpus? If the government arrests you and you say, I want to talk to a judge, right? And your jailer says, too bad, you're not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere. But this writ of habeas corpus means, habeas means, a habeas corpus means like, bring me the body, right? Corpus like Corpus Christi, Corpus Christ, right? Body of Christ. Bring me the body. It says you need to go to a judge to justify your detention, right? You can't just detain someone indefinitely. What's this bill of attainder business or ex post facto laws, right? Ex post facto means, okay, you did something today, tomorrow I'll make it illegal, and then we'll throw you in jail. No good. You cannot be punished for laws changed after your conduct. Only going forward. And what's a bill of attainder? Oh, these were evil, right? These were laws passed for one person, right? So if I said only, Michelle has to go to jail, right? No good. You can't have a law named after one person, because then the Congress becomes a court, and you can't have that violation of separation of powers. Ah, this one's a good one. No money shall be drawn without an appropriation, right? What does that mean? The president can't spend money however he likes. The president can only spend money if Congress says you can. And by the way, all appropriations, 2 years long. So every new Congress, the president has to go back and get a new budget. That's why we need a new budget every 2 years, or at least we're supposed to, right? The reason why is appropriations last only 2 years. I love this one. No title of nobility by the United States, right? We don't have any titles of nobility. In fact, this is actually a question of President Obama won the Nobel Prize. Technically, the Nobel Prize is a title of nobility because he's, whatever. I think it was a closer call, but he disagreed. Okay. Article 1, Section 10 puts limitations on the states. Okay, what are these limitations? Again, like the Articles of Confederation, states can't make treaties. States can't make confederations. Okay, states also can't do these bill of attainders, ex post facto laws, right? So not only are states relinquishing certain powers by joining this union, the states are actually being regulated by the Constitution itself. Okay. And that's all Article 1. Article 2, recall, is the powers of the executive. So I want to contrast something, right? Remember Article 1, Section 1 began. All legislative powers herein granted, right? Congress only has the powers that are listed in the Constitution, right? Contrast that with this. The executive power shall be vested in a president. Does it say which executive powers? No. Does it say only the executive powers here? No. It's the executive powers. This is the basis of what's often called a unitary executive. The idea that there's one president and he has all these broad powers and they're not listed. In fact, the Constitution does not specify what the executive's powers are. Okay? A lot of Article 2 is discussing how the president's elected, and I'll summarize it briefly. You don't vote for the president. You vote for what's called electors, right? Every state has a number of electors, which is based on the number of members of Congress and the number of senators added together. So say if Texas has 30 members of Congress and 2 senators, Texas has 32 electoral votes. So when you vote for, whoever, Bush or McCain, whoever, right, you're actually voting for their electors. And the electors cast the vote. Very complicated reasons why, which I don't really want to go into right now. I'll skip over that. This provision is everyone's favorite. No person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Okay, what's a natural-born citizen? This is a favorite law professor hypothetical. Is a person born through cesarean section, natural-born? Oh, I don't know, right? It's a good question to get you thinking, right? But this came up. The irony of all this is that John McCain had the weakest claim to be a natural-born citizen. He was actually born in the Panama Canal Zone. So this was actually a borderline case. Well, I think he was, but it was a close call. Okay, and actually Mitt Romney's father was born in Mexico, although he probably would run for president as well. But these things go. Okay. This provision is very significant because it puts the president in charge as the commander-in-chief of the military. In other words, the states don't have their own military authority. That every military person in the country looks up to the president. In fact, by the grace of God, we had George Washington as the first president who was the ultimate commander-in-chief. Right? Okay. And what else can the president do? Well, the president can make treaties with foreign countries, right? He negotiates the treaty with foreign countries, but he cannot do so by himself. The Senate, by a vote of 2/3, must ratify the treaty. So for anyone following the current Iranian deal, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, it's not a treaty. It's an executive agreement. Remember that pushing down the steps, right? Executive order type deal, right? And there's no requirement to go through the Senate. But usually, treaties require a 2/3 vote. Okay. What else? The president's also power is to nominate. Nominate ambassadors, nominate judges, and nominate members of the executive branch, his cabinet. The president's power to nominate judges is probably the most significant power he has, for reasons which will become very clear in this class, because the judges of the Supreme Court are extremely instrumental in deciding the shape of constitutional law. So a president's power to appoint judges can really change the country. Okay. Okay. Here's a clause which most people probably never thought of much, but I think is very, very important. The president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So we all study that Congress writes the laws, the courts interpret them, and the president enforces them. But what happens if the president decides not to enforce a law? What happens if the president decides, I don't like that law? Maybe an immigration law, or a drug law, or whatever it is, right? What's the check on the president if he decides, nah, I don't like that law? Is it just impeachment? Does the Constitution require him to execute the law in good faith? We'll talk about that issue. This was a very big issue last semester. It might be a little bigger this year as a certain case involving immigration in Texas go on up. Article 2, Section 4, impeachment. Indeed, if the president screws up, Congress can throw him out of office. We've had 2 impeachments of U.S. presidents, neither removed. Andrew Johnson was impeached, 1 vote shy of removal by the Senate. President Clinton was impeached, wasn't even close. That was not going anywhere. But the president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, a term which is not defined. Okay, we move on to Article 3. This is our home for the semester. Article 3 describes, we'll be here a lot. Article 3 describes the federal courts. The judicial power of the United States, not all judicial powers granted, the judicial powers, whatever those are. The judicial powers shall be vested in one Supreme Court. That one sentence creates a Supreme Court. It cannot be destroyed. It cannot be abolished. But they also have these inferior courts, what we might call lower courts. Inferior sounds so mean, right? They're lower courts, right? But these are courts that Congress can create from time to time. You'll recall that in the Declaration of Independence, judges depend on their salary from who? The king. Not here. The judges hold their officers are in good behavior. That means for life. Okay? Now, unless a judge screws up, which is very rare, they screw up all the time, but really screw up, right? They hold their position for the rest of their lives. This was meant to have an independent judiciary. That judges would not have to answer to the governor. Now, what's interesting is Texas and many states have elected judiciaries, which we'll maybe talk about a little bit later. Oh, and by the way, their compensation can't be diminished. You cannot reduce the pay of a judge. You're also not required to increase it, which makes them very angry. Judges don't get pay increases very often. This is actually a big fuss. They want a cost of living adjustment. They don't get that usually. Okay. Now, the subject of Marbury versus Madison, which I'm sure all of you studied, is actually fairly boring. Okay. It's about the scope of the judicial power and what we often call jurisdiction. Now, I'm sure you've learned this in other classes, but jurisdiction refers to the power of a court to hear a case. Federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. Let me say that again. Federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. You probably read one of this in Civ Pro. Federal courts only have jurisdiction where the Constitution gives them jurisdiction. If a federal court lacks jurisdiction, they throw the case out. In contrast, states courts are courts of general. Sound familiar? General jurisdiction, you learned this? I see some nodding. That means they can hear anything they want. Okay? So what are called the heads of jurisdiction, or the specific grant of jurisdiction? Right here. The judicial power shall extend to all cases and controversies, right? These are the magic words, cases and controversies. Just remember that. We'll come back to it later. Cases affecting ambassadors, cases affecting the United States will be a party. By the way, everyone know about diversity jurisdiction? And where that comes from? Oh, it's not 1331. It's that, right? Why do you think the Constitution would give federal courts jurisdiction over parties from different states? Because they don't trust the state courts. They don't trust the state courts to be honest. They want an independent, fair, and neutral federal court to resolve jurisdictions between different states and between citizens of different states. By the way, that's where diversity jurisdiction. It's not from Civ Pro. It's from the Constitution. We came first, okay? I love Civ Pro, but this one's much more fun. Okay. This will also be relevant for your reading for Wednesday, which I hope some of you have already done. And night students usually do. The Supreme Court has two types of jurisdiction: original and appellate. Okay? Appellate jurisdiction means some lower court issued a decision, and you appeal to the Supreme Court. That's what you all know it as. But the Supreme Court also has original jurisdiction. Yes, believe it or not, you can go straight to the Supreme Court and file a lawsuit there. It happens every year. You may see this usually when one state sues another state over some sort of a boundary dispute involving water. There's always water disputes, right? So if it's a case in which a state shall be a party, the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, right? Otherwise, they only have appellate. Pay very close attention for Marbury versus Madison. I'll give you a hint. Where did Mr. Marbury file his lawsuit? In the Supreme Court. Marbury did not file his lawsuit in the lower courts. Can you file sort of action he did right in the Supreme Court? No. But read the case and you'll see why. But that's a little preview. Okay. What else do we have? We have the right of trial by jury. This is a very significant right because you may recall that during the American Revolution, the king suspended the rights of trial by jury. You'll notice that a lot of the provisions in our Constitution, Bill of Rights, are directly from grievances against the king. That the king did things wrong, we will do them right. We will give the rights the king denied. Okay, okay, and that's Article 3. Okay, Article 4. Okay, what's Article 4 about? Full faith and credit shall be given for all the records. So what if, you have a contract that's valid in, New York, and then you want to enforce it in a New Jersey court? Can you do that? Yes, because of the Constitution. Imagine trying to have a national economic network where contracts can be enforced across state lines or licenses, whatever. Okay. Remember this phrase? Remember I told you privileges and immunities, right? Remember that? This is directly from the Articles of Confederation. All citizens are entitled to these privileges and immunities. So if a citizen of New York, or as I say, citizen of Maryland goes to Pennsylvania, entitled to all their rights. But who is a citizen and who is not a citizen? Slaves. So rather than saying other persons or such persons or something like that, they just say citizens. Because that means a runaway slave from Georgia who gets into Pennsylvania cannot claim these privileges and immunities. They tried. Many of the abolitionists said, oh, I'm a citizen of whatever state. And they're like, no, you're not. We'll get back to that later. And then, as if to make it any more clear, these two provisions were known as the fugitive slave provisions. Basically say if any person held to service or labor, that means slave, escapes, okay, the governor of that state is basically required to return him to his home state. Shall be delivered on a claim of the party to whom service or labor may be due. That means master. Okay? So even though the Constitution had a lot of these sorts of compromises on the issue of the fugitive slave clause, it was very strict. And this was a law that was extremely wicked in how it was enforced. Okay, Article 4, Section 3. Yep, new states can come in. They have the entire western horizon. They realize at some point new states would be admitted. Okay. All right, so here we come to the money, right? How many states were required in the Articles to change the Articles? All of them, right? The Articles of Confederation required unanimous support to change it. This Constitution, though, not so much. So how to change the Constitution? Two ways. If 2/3 of the House and Senate decide to change the Constitution, then 3/4 of the state have to agree. Or, if 2/3 of the states agree, we start a constitutional convention. And then 3/4 of the states have to ratify. I will make a bold prediction for you. I don't think we will ever see another constitutional amendment in your lifespans or mine. For 3/4 of the states to agree on anything, not going to happen, right? Maybe I'll be wrong, but the United States is quite polarized, and I can't imagine 3/4 of the states agree on anything, let alone an amendment to the Constitution. To that I say good. I don't want people screwing with the Constitution. They'll make it worse, okay? More often than not, when you change stuff, you make it worse. Let's leave it. I don't think any amendments will be worthwhile. All right, Article 6. This is very critical. The Supremacy Clause. This single provision holds the Constitution together. It says that all federal laws are the supreme law of the land. Supreme law of the land. What happens if there's a state law that conflicts with the federal law? The federal law controls. This states very clearly that the states cannot get around federal laws they dislike. And even more so, what happens if a state passes a law that conflicts with the federal law? Well, as it turns out, the courts have the power to invalidate those laws. That's also not in the Constitution. Did you see anywhere in the Constitution something about courts invalidating laws? No. But don't worry, they acquire that power in due time. But all federal laws are supreme, and they prevail over state law. Okay? Okay, so then we come down to the last page of the Constitution for the Bill of Rights. Article 7. The ratification of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. 9 states? 9 states? I thought we needed all the states to change the Constitution, right? Where are we getting 9 from? They changed the rules. Even though the Constitution was meant to be ratified among unanimous consent, they said we only need 9. Okay? So in effect, our own Constitution didn't follow what the articles required. So could we change the Constitution ourselves? Maybe. Maybe not. All right? We move on. We got a half hour left. I'm right on target. I told you, this is why I can't take questions. Come up afterwards, ask me all the questions you want, but this one I need to get through. We have 27 amendments. I said before that we have the longest serving document in the world that's been changed only 27 times. Go look at a European constitution. There are hundreds of amendments. Even the Texas Constitution has hundreds of amendments. It's a long document. 27. Although, to be fair, much of that's because the Supreme Court has expanded the Constitution in ways that are not reflected in the text, but we still have only 27 amendments. The First Amendment, or actually the first 10 amendments, what are known as the Bill of Rights, this is what most people think the Constitution is. I want to beat that over your head. That's not true. The most important aspects of the Constitution are not in the Bill of Rights. They're these structural separation of powers provisions, where each branch checks each other. These are far more important than anything in the Bill of Rights. Justice Scalia, who you'll learn a lot about, has this great expression. He says, any dictator, any third world dictator has a Bill of Rights. Want to see a beautiful Bill of Rights? Go look at the Soviet Union's Bill of Rights. Go look at North Korea's constitution. Beautiful documents, all these rights protected. But what ensures that people protect free speech and free religion? Not pieces of paper, not what are called parchment barriers. It's the structural protections of ensuring the president required to enforce the laws Congress creates, and people vote for Congress, they can remove members of Congress the next election. All these things colliding with each other ensure we have a free society, not a Bill of Rights. And in fact, the Bill of Rights were an afterthought. The Constitution was ratified, there was no Bill of Rights. It came several years later. So we will study the Bill of Rights, but I want to beat out of your heads this idea that all we need to learn about is the First Amendment. No. This stuff is good, but give me structure. Give me how many people it takes to pass a law. Give me how votes are apportioned. Give me redistricting. That's where freedom lies, not a fluffy Bill of Rights. So let's talk about the fluffy Bill of Rights now, okay? That's which I just disparaged terribly. I exercise my First Amendment right. Yes, Congress, there are 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. It says Congress shall make the law respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right to people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. This is meant to provide free thought and free religion and free exercise of that. Okay? We will discuss at great length at the end of the year why these are important. And probably these are the ones you've thought most about. Okay. Amendment 2. Oh, by the way, trick question. How many amendments were originally proposed in the Constitution? 12. Okay. I want you to cheat, right? Turn to the 27th Amendment. Right? It'll be on the last page of your Constitution. And there should be a little footnote there, right? I have a different version. Oh, yours doesn't have it. Okay, anyway. Unfortunately, you have the. I prefer this one, but I ran out of these, so I gave you the other ones. Okay. The 27th Amendment of the Constitution was proposed in 1789. Do you know what year it was ratified? 1991. Actually, 92, I'm sorry. It was proposed in 1791 and ratified in 1992. Okay? This was actually supposed to be one of the first 2 amendments that was never ratified until 200 years later, which is pretty cool. So what we actually know is the First Amendment, free speech, that was actually the Third Amendment. And we know as the Second Amendment, guns, was actually the Fourth Amendment. Okay, you'll win that in trivia one day. Okay. So the Second Amendment, okay? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay? This was one of our more contentious amendments in present-day history. And we'll talk a little about the Second Amendment, but the key thing to keep in mind here is the Supreme Court recognized 2 different clauses. Okay? The first clause, separated by the comma, is what's called the prefatory clause, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. This was the idea that this was the purpose, right? This was an aspiration, right? We should have the people, right? By the way, who are the militia? All of us. We are all in the militia. Every American is in the militia. You may not know that, but you actually are. You can be called up to duty anytime you want, anytime the government seeks. Okay? And why do we have a militia? To protect the security of a free state. Believe it or not, the militia were organized by the states. And who are they meant to fight against? The federal government. Yes, indeed. The reason why states had a militia was that the federal government got out of hand. They could send the state troops to basically take out the feds. That's a jarring thought today, but that's how it was structured. What about the second clause, right? The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, this one is debated, right? And this one produced a 5-4 decision in a case called District of Columbia v. Heller. Okay? One interpretation, the one adopted by the majority, says, well, this applies to all the people, that all the people have the right to bear arms in self-defense. Okay? The dissent said, no. This only affects the right to bear arms in the militia, right? That the federal government can't disarm the state militia. I personally don't think that's a persuasive explanation, but this was a 5-4 decision and a very contentious one at that. We'll talk more about guns later, I promise. Okay. Third Amendment. People say it's irrelevant, but it's not. It says there is no quartering of troops without the consent of the owner. Okay. You'll recall that during the Declaration of Independence, one of the ways the king kept an eye on people is by stationing troops in their houses. No go under the Constitution. So people say, oh, Josh, this amendment's stupid. It doesn't apply anymore. Oh, it does, right? It was actually a case a couple months ago, maybe it was about a year ago now, where police officers wanted to conduct a drug sting in someone's house and monitor a house across the street. Okay, the house owner brought a suit under the Third Amendment, saying that you were quartering troops in my house. Unfortunately, the court said that police officers are not the military, so that they don't count. But there was another case where it did work. During a natural disaster, a bunch of National Guards, National Guard basically said, we need to come in your house now. The other like, no, and they just barged in. They brought a suit in the Third Amendment and won. So, if any federal agents come into your home, you know what to do. Third, not second, Texas. Go for it. just to be clear. I taught ConLaw during the Bundy Ranch standoff last year, the year before, so I had to make that one really clear. The Fourth Amendment, this one you probably learned about in crim law at some point, which is the right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures, right? This is a privacy amendment. If the police want to search you, go get a warrant. Always get a warrant, okay? This also comes from our Revolutionary War experience. We had remember, writs of assistance, right? These were these general licenses where the police were allowed to search anything, anywhere. Those are unconstitutional. You can only get a warrant on probable cause. You have to explain why you have an entitlement to search my house. Otherwise, get out. I love those doormats saying, get a warrant. You've seen those? They send the message very well. Amendment 5. Oh, this is a little bit of a hodgepodge, which throws just about everything in, right? So one of which is a grand jury requirement. If the police want to throw you in jail, they need to get a grand jury. People of your peers to agree. There's an old expression. It's been attributed to Frederick Douglass, but it's probably he didn't make it up, saying that there are 4 boxes for freedom. There's the ballot box, the soap box, the jury box, and the powder box. So let me explain that, right? So what are the 4 boxes of freedom? So you have the soap box, right? You can skin up and speak. There's the ballot box. You can vote for whoever you want. There's the jury box, which means you can basically acquit people who should not have been convicted. You vote your conscience. And if all else fails, you have the powder box, which means you have armed revolution. Well, this is one provision people don't think much about. It's something called jury nullification, which you may have studied, which says basically a jury can decide not to convict someone because it'll be unjust. That's in there. We have the double jeopardy clause saying you can't be tried twice for the same crime. You can't be forced to be a witness against yourself. Everyone says, I take the 5th, right? Yeah, this is where it comes from. You can't be forced to take a witness. You'll study this in property. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This was called the takings clause, also been written out of the Constitution by the Kelo decision. And finally, this is a biggie. You cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. What is due process of law? We will spend about 4 weeks on that topic. Okay, what are these processes? It basically means whatever the courts want it to mean. It's a very broad phrase, but we'll spend a lot of time on that provision. Okay. The 6th Amendment, these are also criminal procedure rights. It discusses speedy trials, impartial juries. You can confront the witnesses who go against you, right? Someone can't just testify in secret. You have to confront the witness so you can cross-examine them and challenge them. You also have a right to assistance of counsel. That doesn't mean the government pays for your lawyer, but the Supreme Court said that means you have the right to a paid government attorney. 7th Amendment. In civil cases, not criminal, but civil cases, you have the right to trial by jury. Of course, in matters exceeding, $20, which is not adjusted for inflation. So basically, in any case, you can request a civil jury. 8th Amendment, which I'm sure you studied, says no cruel and unusual punishment, right? This is a very contentious issue today in light of the death penalty, right? Is the death penalty cruel and unusual? What about the lethal injection, these different protocols? There's more litigation in the 8th Amendment. We will not talk about that in this class, but I encourage you to study it elsewhere. It's a very contentious area. And let's finish up the 9th Amendment with 2 of my favorites, the ones people never pay attention to. The 9th and the 10th Amendment. These are 2 sides of the same coin. Okay, so let me explain like this. We just listed 8 amendments. You have free speech, you got guns, you have warrants. Are those all of our freedoms? Are those all of our rights? No. So why don't we add another one, 11, 12, 13? Would it be possible to list all of our freedoms in a document? Impossible, right? I often use this imagery, right? So imagine that we have this vast sea of freedom, right? A sea of liberty. And these little islands dotting throughout. These are your government, right? So generally speaking, unless you crash into an island, you're free to do whatever the heck you want. It's impossible to list all of our freedoms. So we have the 9th Amendment saying, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Remember in contracts, the expressio unius canon? Remember? Just because some stuff's listed doesn't mean this other stuff isn't. That's what this says. The mere fact that you list certain rights doesn't mean that there are other rights which are non-existent, right? You have rights beyond those which are listed. What are these rights retained by the people? Oh, well, that's a contentious argument, but we can all agree saying our rights are not only those that are listed, we have more rights than what are in the Constitution. But what's the flip side to that? The 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. are reserved to the states. So remember I showed you Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates or lists all the powers, commerce, trade, coining money, all that stuff. What if a power is not listed there? It's reserved to the states. We start with the presumption that the states have all the power unless they gave some of it up. And any power not explicitly listed for Congress belongs to the states and to the people. These two amendments put the finishing touches in the Constitution. They basically say your rights are not limited by this document, but the powers of the federal government are limited. You have rights beyond those listed here, but Congress has no powers beyond those listed. Ever know the difference between a right and a power? People use these things. Say the government has the right. No. Governments have powers. People have rights. People have rights. Governments have powers. The rights are unlimited. The powers are limited. That's what this says. The Ninth Amendment says your rights are not limited. 10th Amendment says, but the powers are. And make sure you embrace and internalize this distinction because people far too often don't get that. Okay. The 11th Amendment we'll talk about later this semester, which basically says you can't sue a state that you live in, right? So if you live in Texas, you can't sue Texas in state court. If any of you ever do any sort of civil rights work and your client's injured by the state, good luck because you can't really sue the state. It's complicated. We'll talk about it later. The 12th Amendment changes the way the presidents are elected. Believe it or not, under the original Constitution, the president and vice president didn't run together. Whoever had the most votes was president. Whoever had the second most votes was VP. This was changed because it made no sense to have a president and vice president that hated each other. So, for example, President Thomas Jefferson, his VP was John Adams, and they hated each other. Absolutely hated each other, right? So we don't have that problem. Yep. I'm not sorry. President Adams, Adams was the president, Jefferson was the VP, and they hated each other. Sorry. I have a class immediately before this one, 3:40 till 5:10, and you're from 5:30 to 7:30, so it's like a marathon. So I have to figure the pacing out. I'm not sure yet. Okay. Okay, don't need that one much. Okay. And then we go on to the 13th Amendment. These are the biggies. 13, 14, 15. These are what are called the Reconstruction or the Civil War Amendments. 13 eliminated slavery. 14 guaranteed equal protection. 15 extended the vote to the freed slaves. Get those by heart. 13 eradicated slavery. 14th was equal protection. And 15 was a vote. These, in many respects, completed the Constitution. It was an incomplete document for these points. And the people that ratified this had differing goals of what they meant. So roughly half our semester, we're trying to figure out what do these 13, 14, and 15 amendments mean. So we start. 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. What's unique about this provision, and unlike any other in the Constitution, is that it places limits on private conduct. The entire Constitution is a limit on government, except for this. This doesn't limit government, it limits private people. Slavery shall not exist. That means you, and you. None of you can hold slaves. Nothing else in the Constitution impacts private individuals like this. It's a remarkable provision. And, oh, by the way, if the states try and take action otherwise, Congress has power to enforce this legislation. And remember, federal legislation is supreme law of the land that trumps state laws. The 14th Amendment is probably the most important provision we'll study all year. Has many sections. We'll focus on section 1. Remember I said before that there was really no citizenship under the Constitution for slaves? Right here. All persons born or naturalized in the United States. If you were born here, you are a citizen. And not just a citizen of the United States, but a citizen of Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi, whatever state you live in. And your state must recognize you as a full citizen. And not only that, no state shall abridge these privileges or immunities of these citizens. So these rights which the people have can no longer be denied to the people who now are citizens. And not just that, you'll notice that the Fifth Amendment, I forgot to mention this, Amendments 1 through 8 only apply to the federal government. Now we have limits on the states. The states cannot deny you these privileges and immunities. The states cannot deprive you of due process of law. The states have to provide you equal protection of the law. This places affirmative limits on the states. And notice it says nothing about race or color. It's all persons are guaranteed equal protection. No more of these castes, right? Go skip section 2. Section 5, we'll spend a lot of time on. Again, if states are depriving you of equal protection, Congress can step in. So the Reconstruction Amendments radically alter the balance of power between the state and the federal government, radically. But it was done deliberately to ensure equality in many respects. 15th Amendment, the right to vote. Here, it says shall not be denied on the basis of race, color, or servitude, which basically means former slaves. Notice it doesn't say women. It's actually very interesting. Susan B. Anthony, many of the suffragists, tried to say, wait a minute, right? I'm a citizen of the 14th Amendment. I want to vote. Yeah, but if we needed an amendment to give blacks the vote, we need another amendment for women to have the vote. Oh, ultimately, yes, we got that later. Okay. 16th Amendment. This is everyone's favorite one come April 15th. This is the Income Tax Amendment. Yeah, so now not only can taxes be laid by the federal government based on population, but also can be laid based on income. So if you have a salary or paycheck, which I'm assuming all of you do, you pay a nice chunk of change to Uncle Sam every year. Okay. 17th Amendment. Senators are no longer chosen by the state legislatures. Now senators will be chosen by the people. This drastically altered our balance we call federalism, because this removed a check this removed the check the states had on the Senate. So now it was the people who voted. Okay. 18th Amendment, not a very popular one. Prohibition, right? I said before the 13th Amendment is the only provision that acts on people. This one too. This banned the sale and transportation of intoxicating liquors. Thankfully, this one only existed for about a decade. It was soon to be repealed, okay, by the 21st Amendment. In fact, in the District of Columbia, there's actually a bar called the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. It's a DC thing. 19th Amendment, suffrage for women, right? The right to vote shall be denied on the basis of sex. Okay, 20th Amendment, not too important. It basically says when the presidential term begins and ends. Not very significant. Okay. 21st Amendment, yes, we can all party and go drink afterwards. Prohibition was repealed. Whoopee, right? Happy days. Okay. 22nd Amendment is the Franklin Roosevelt Amendment. Until this, we did not have term limits on the presidency. And after FDR ran for a record-breaking 4 times, he was only stopped by death, the Constitution was amended to say that the office of presidency is limited to 2 terms. This was actually a tradition started by George Washington, and the first president who tried to break it was Teddy Roosevelt. Fortunately, he didn't win, and then his cousin Franklin did. So you got, other than the Roosevelts, we've had compliance with Washington. Okay. The 23rd Amendment basically gave voting rights to the District of Columbia. Not too significant. Okay, the 24th Amendment eliminated poll taxes. And this was effectively a tool of Jim Crow, which charged mostly blacks a fee to go vote. If you've been paying attention, there's actually a trial going on concerning Texas's voting laws. And one of the arguments was that the requirement in Texas to obtain an identification card is, in fact, a poll tax. The district court agreed. The Court of Appeals just reversed that. That's probably the right call, but there are other things going on there. 25th Amendment, this is like your Tom Clancy, Jack Bauer 24 stuff, right? This is what happens when stuff goes awry, when there's a presidential disability. And I encourage you, just take a minute and read through it. I don't have the time for it. But actually read through it and see what happens if the president is disabled. And how are we supposed to have a functioning government? If the vice president assumes power, the president says, oh, no, I can do it, right? Can Congress override that? Really fascinating stuff. I hope we never have to actually go through this. But it actually happened briefly after President Reagan was shot by John Hinckley in 1981 because it was actually a mini power coup while he was under search of who would be in charge. And in fact, whenever the president undergoes a colonoscopy, which I think Obama's done a couple times, he actually has a temporary message to Congress saying, I'll be under anesthesia, Uncle Joe's in charge. So we can do with that what we will. Yeah, but read through the 25th Amendment. It's actually very thrilling as far as constitutional law goes. 26th Amendment, yes, the brats, right? So it gave the right to vote to the 18-year-olds. The efficacy of that one's still, the verdict's still out. And with 4 minutes to spare, my best time yet, we have the 27th Amendment, which I said was originally proposed in 1791, but ratified in 1992. What does it say? Members of Congress can't raise their own pay. Any salary increases take place in the next election. So say the current Congress says, we need more money. Okay, they can't raise their own salary. The salary increase will take place in the next cycle. That's the Constitution, my friends. Thank you very much. And I will see all of you in class on Wednesday. Thank you so much.